Did you ever tell anyone what really happened that night in the dorm? That was the first sentence out of her mouth. No hello, no sorry for calling so late. Just that one question, delivered in a voice I hadn't heard in exactly 10 years, shaking hard enough that I could hear it even through a bad phone connection at 12:14 in the morning. I'm Theo, 33 now, and the woman on the other end of that call was Willa, someone I hadn't spoken to since the week we both graduated college a decade ago. We weren't just casual acquaintances back then. For 3 years, Willa was one of maybe 2 people I trusted completely, the kind of friendship where you don't need to explain context, where a 2 a.m. conversation about nothing in particular felt as natural as breathing. Then, in our final semester, something happened that ended all of it in the space of about a week, and we simply never spoke again. No dramatic falling out, no explosive argument caught by mutual friends, just a clean, total silence that somehow lasted 10 full years. Before I get into why she was calling now, out of nowhere, at midnight, with a question like that, I need to back up and explain what actually happened senior year, because none of what came later makes sense without it. Willa and I met freshman year in a shared elective, some intro sociology class neither of us particularly cared about, and became close fast, in that specific way college friendships sometimes do when you're both still figuring out who you're becoming. We weren't romantically involved, never had been, though I won't pretend the thought never crossed my mind once or twice over those years. Mostly we were just genuinely good friends, the kind who ended up living in the same dorm building by junior year on purpose, one floor apart, in and out of each other's rooms constantly. There was a third person in our tight little group back then, a guy named Corbin, who I'd known since freshman orientation and who eventually became close with both of us. The 3 of us were basically inseparable by senior year, study sessions that turned into late-night takeout, road trips during breaks, the whole thing. Corbin and Willa started dating around the start of our final year, which honestly felt natural at the time, 2 people I already loved as friends finding something together, and for a while it was genuinely good to watch. Then, about 6 weeks before graduation, everything fell apart in a single night, and the specifics of that night were exactly what Willa was asking me about, 10 years later, in a shaking voice at midnight. I remember it clearly even now. There was a party in our dorm building, one of those chaotic end-of-year blowouts everyone throws once finals pressure starts easing off. I left early, wasn't really in a party mood that week, and went back to my room to sleep. Sometime around 2 in the morning, I woke up to frantic knocking on my door. It was Willa, visibly shaken, asking if she could stay in my room for the night, refusing to explain why beyond saying she and Corbin had a bad fight and she didn't want to be near him. I let her in, obviously, gave her my bed, took the floor myself, didn't push for details since she clearly wasn't in a state to give them. The next morning, she was gone before I woke up, and by that afternoon, campus rumors were already spreading fast about something that had happened at that same party, something involving Corbin and another girl from our floor, a girl named Priscilla who I barely knew. The specifics varied depending on who was telling the story, but the gist was consistent enough. Corbin had done something with Priscilla that night, something that ended his relationship with Willa on the spot. What I never told anyone, not even Willa directly at the time, was something I'd seen myself that night before falling asleep, something that didn't quite match the version of events that ended up circulating campus-wide over the following days. What I'd actually seen before Willa ever showed up knocking on my door that night was Corbin and Priscilla together earlier in the evening, out on the fire escape attached to our dorm building, a spot most people used to sneak cigarettes away from the RAs. I'd stepped out there myself around 11:30, before the party got too crowded, needing a break from the noise, and found the 2 of them already out there, deep in conversation, close enough that it registered as odd to me even in the moment, though not alarming exactly, since Corbin and Priscilla had studied group history together and I had no particular reason to assume anything romantic. I didn't stay long, maybe 10 minutes, mostly listening to them talk about some shared class project. Nothing that struck me as inappropriate at the time. I went back inside, hung around the party a while longer, then left for my room around midnight, well before whatever actually happened later that night that ended up fracturing 3 lives at once. The version that spread around campus over the following days painted Corbin as having been caught in the act with Priscilla, something explicit, something Willa had apparently walked in on directly, which was reportedly why she'd shown up at my door so shaken. I never fully understood the specifics because Willa refused to discuss it with anyone, myself included, retreating into a kind of silent, controlled devastation for the remaining weeks of senior year, avoiding both Corbin and Priscilla entirely, and, without any real explanation, gradually pulling away from me too until by graduation week we were barely speaking, and then, once we both left campus for good, not speaking at all. I'd always assumed, over the following 10 years, that our friendship simply hadn't survived the collateral damage of that breakup, that being close with both of them had made me somehow guilty by association in her mind, or that the entire situation had just been too painful for her to want any reminder of that period in her life, myself included. I never pushed for more information, never reached out, mostly out of respect for what seemed like a clear signal she needed distance, and over time, the silence itself became its own kind of normal, the way these things sometimes do. So when my phone rang at 12:14 that Tuesday morning, an unknown number, I almost let go to voicemail out of pure reflex, and Willa's voice came through instead, older, rougher around the edges but unmistakably hers, asking that exact question. Did you ever tell anyone what really happened that night in the dorm? I genuinely didn't know what to say for a long moment, caught completely off guard by both the timing and the specificity of it. Willa, I finally managed. It's been 10 years. What's going on? Are you okay? There was a long pause on her end, the sound of her breathing unsteady, like she was somewhere quiet but clearly upset. I need to know if you ever told anyone about seeing Corbin and Priscilla on the fire escape that night, before everything happened. My stomach did something strange hearing that, because I genuinely never mentioned that detail to anyone in 10 years, not even to Willa herself back then, mostly because it never seemed relevant to whatever had actually happened later that night, and partly because it wasn't my story to tell. No, I said carefully. I never told anyone that. Why are you asking me this now, after 10 years, at midnight? Another long pause, and then she said something that completely reframed everything I thought I understood about that night, and about the 10 years of silence that followed it. Because I just found out, 3 days ago, that nothing actually happened between Corbin and Priscilla that night. Not the way I thought. Not the way everyone thought. And I need to figure out who actually told me it did, because whoever it was completely destroyed my life over something that was never even real. I sat up straighter on my couch, phone pressed hard against my ear, feeling the entire foundation of a decade-old memory start to shift under me. Wait. Slow down, what do you mean nothing happened? You were there, weren't you? You said you walked in on something. That's the thing, Willa said, and I could hear her voice cracking slightly. The particular strain of someone who'd clearly been awake far too long, turning something over obsessively in her head before finally deciding to call. I didn't walk in on anything. I never actually saw them together that night. Someone told me they had, in graphic detail, specific enough that I believed it completely, and I was so devastated I didn't even think to question it. I just ran straight to your room without ever actually confirming anything with my own eyes. Who told you? I asked, already feeling a cold, uneasy sense of where this might be heading. Marisol, she said, and the name landed somewhere in my memory, vague but present. A girl who'd lived on our floor senior year, someone Willa had been reasonably close with at the time, though I'd never known her particularly well myself. She came to me that night, right in the middle of the party, pulled me aside, told me she'd just seen Corbin and Priscilla going into one of the empty study rooms together, described exactly what she claimed she saw through the door before someone closed it. I believed her completely. Why wouldn't I? She had no reason to lie to me. So what changed? Why are you finding this out now, 10 years later? Willa exhaled slowly, and when she spoke again, her voice had shifted into something flatter, more controlled, like she was forcing herself through the facts methodically, because the emotional version of telling this story had already worn her down too many times over the past 3 days. Marisol reached out to me last week, completely out of nowhere, said she needed to get something off her chest before she got married next month, some kind of clearing her conscience thing. She told me the truth. She'd never actually seen anything that night. She made the whole story up because she'd had feelings for Corbin herself since freshman year and was jealous watching him and me together for over a year. She said watching him talk to Priscilla that night at the party, nothing more than normal conversation apparently, gave her the opening she needed, and she just took it, invented details specific enough to be believable, and destroyed my entire relationship in about 10 minutes flat. I felt something cold settle into my chest hearing that, the sheer, casual cruelty of it landing slowly as the full shape of what she was describing came into focus. Willa, that's insane. 10 years. You spent 10 years believing something that never happened, based on one person's lie. I know, she said, and her voice cracked properly this time. And it's not even just the relationship, Theo. It's everything after it. I pulled away from Corbin, obviously, but I also pulled away from you, from basically everyone from that entire period of my life, because being around any of it felt unbearable. I moved across the country for grad school partly just to get away from all the memories. I've spent a decade telling myself a story about the worst night of my life that apparently never actually happened the way I believed it did. I didn't know what to say for a moment, sitting there in the dark at nearly midnight, trying to process not just what she was telling me, but what it meant that she'd called me specifically. First, before apparently reaching out to Corbin or anyone else from that period. Why call me, though? Why am I the first person you're telling this to? There was a pause, longer than the others, and when she finally answered, something in her tone shifted into something more careful, more deliberate. Because I remember you were out on that fire escape earlier that night too, before everything happened. I remembered it randomly a few days ago, going back over every detail I could recall from that whole period trying to make sense of everything Marisol just told me. I need to know exactly what you actually saw, because I think I've been building an entire decade of my life around a lie, and I don't trust my own memory of that night anymore. I need someone who was actually there, who wasn't the one lying to me, to just tell me the truth. I sat with that for a moment, understanding suddenly why my honest answer, the one I'd never had a reason to share with anyone in 10 years, mattered so much more than I'd initially realized. I saw them on the fire escape, around 11:30. They were talking, seemed normal, something about a class project as far as I could tell. I stayed maybe 10 minutes, didn't see anything that struck me as more than that, and then I went back inside. I never saw them go into any study room, never saw anything that matched what you're describing Marisol telling you. I always just assumed something happened later after I'd already gone to bed, since that's basically what everyone believed at the time. There was no later, Willa said quietly. Marisol told me flat out, 3 days ago, sitting in my kitchen, that she made the entire study room story up from nothing. Corbin and Priscilla apparently talked for maybe 20 minutes on that fire escape about a shared class project, exactly like you're describing, and then went their separate ways for the rest of the night. That's it. That's the entire scandal that ended my relationship and, honestly, ended us too. I let that sit in the silence between us for a long moment, both of us apparently trying to process the same information from very different angles. Me trying to understand why this mattered enough to prompt a midnight call after 10 years of nothing. Her clearly trying to figure out how to rebuild an entire decade's worth of context around a single lie she'd just discovered. Have you told Corbin any of this yet? I finally asked. No, she said, and something in her voice tightened further. I don't even know where to start with that conversation. I destroyed things with him over something that never happened. I never gave him a chance to explain, never asked him directly what happened that night. I just believed Marisol completely and cut him off within days. He tried calling me for weeks afterward, I remember that now, and I just blocked his number eventually because I couldn't stand hearing his voice. He probably still has no idea why I ended things so abruptly, or what specifically I thought he'd done. Do you know where he is now? I asked, genuinely curious, since I'd lost touch with Corbin just as completely as I had with Willa over the past decade, our entire friend group essentially dissolving in the fallout of that single night. I looked him up a few days ago after Marisol told me everything, Willa admitted. He's married, has 2 kids, from what I could tell from his social media. Seems happy, settled, completely moved on with his life the way people are supposed to after 10 years. Her voice caught slightly on that last part, which honestly made everything worse somehow, seeing that he'd built this whole normal life while I've spent a decade carrying around this specific, permanent hurt that apparently wasn't even based on anything real. I thought about that for a moment, about the strange asymmetry of it. One person moving forward into an entirely new life while another stayed anchored to a version of events that had simply never happened, and I understood, slowly, why she'd needed to call someone tonight, why the weight of 3 days sitting with this information had apparently become unbearable enough to justify a midnight call to someone she hadn't spoken to in 10 years. What are you going to do? I asked. I don't know yet, she admitted. Part of me wants to reach out to him, apologize, explain what actually happened, give him the truth he never got. But another part of me thinks that might just be selfish, showing up in his life now, unannounced, disrupting whatever he's built, just so I can feel better about finally understanding the truth. He's married. He's happy. Maybe the kindest thing is just to let it go and not drag him back into something that ended so long ago. I don't think that's your call to make on his behalf, I said carefully. If someone lied about me that badly, if it cost me a relationship and apparently a decade of trust in someone I actually cared about, I think I'd want to know the truth eventually, even years later. Even if it didn't change anything practically, I think knowing matters. Willa was quiet for a while after that, and I could hear her breathing settle slightly, like something in the conversation had helped, even if it hadn't resolved anything concrete yet. "Can I ask you something else?" she finally said. "Why did we stop talking, exactly? I mean, I know I pulled away after everything happened with Corbin, but you and I weren't even together. There was no reason our friendship needed to end too." I've thought about that a lot over the past few days, actually, more than I expected to. I considered how to answer that honestly, because the truth was something I'd never fully articulated even to myself over the years. I think I assumed you needed space from everything connected to that period, and I didn't want to push, so I just let the silence happen instead of fighting it. Looking back, I probably should have reached out at some point over the years instead of just accepting it as permanent. I don't know why I didn't. Habit, maybe. Once enough time passes, reaching out starts to feel harder than it should, even when there's no real reason for it. "I felt the same way," she said quietly. "Every year or two I'd think about reaching out and then I'd talk myself out of it, telling myself too much time had passed, that it would be weird, that you'd probably moved on completely and wouldn't even want to hear from me. I didn't expect tonight to turn into this either, honestly. I just needed to ask someone who was actually there what they remembered, and you were the only person I could think of who wasn't directly involved in the lie itself." We ended up talking for almost 2 more hours that night, working slowly back through a decade of separate lives, and somewhere in the middle of that conversation, I realized the strangeness of the situation, that a single lie told by someone neither of us had thought about in years had apparently not only ended one relationship, but quietly, invisibly ended a friendship that had nothing directly to do with it at all, simply by association, by proximity, by the sheer weight of everything that unraveled around it. Over the following week, Willa and I texted almost daily, something that felt strange at first, picking back up a rhythm we hadn't shared in 10 years like no time had passed at all, and then slowly, genuinely comfortable, the way old friendships sometimes settle back into place faster than you'd expect once the initial awkwardness clears. She told me she'd been sitting with the decision about Corbin all week, going back and forth, unable to land on whether reaching out would help him or just reopen something better left closed. Then, about 10 days after that midnight call, she texted me something that changed the direction of everything again. "I found Marisol's number in some old messages. I think I need to actually talk to her properly, not just let her drop this on me once and disappear. I want to understand why she really did it, and I want her to say it to my face, not just casually over coffee like she was returning a library book." I offered to come with her, mostly out of instinct, some old protective impulse resurfacing after 10 years dormant, though I genuinely expected her to say no, that this was something she needed to handle on her own terms. Instead, she surprised me. "Actually, yeah, I think I'd want that. You were there that night too, in a way. I think it would help having someone else in the room who actually knows what really happened instead of just my side of it." We met Marisol at a coffee shop the following weekend, a place Willa picked specifically because it was public, neutral ground, somewhere a difficult conversation couldn't spiral into something worse. Marisol looked exactly as I remembered her, though older now, more polished, clearly living a comfortable, settled life, the kind of person who'd apparently buried that specific piece of her past deep enough that confessing it now felt more like closure for her than genuine accountability toward Willa. She confirmed everything Willa had already told me, admitted freely, almost too freely, that she'd invented the entire study room story out of jealousy, that she'd had feelings for Corbin since freshman year, watched him fall for Willa instead over the following years, and simply seized the opportunity that fire escape conversation presented, embellishing details specific enough to be devastating and believable in equal measure. What struck me most, sitting there watching this unfold, was how little genuine remorse actually seemed to register in Marisol's account. More relief at having finally said it out loud than any real reckoning with the decade of consequences that single lie had set into motion. "I know it was wrong," Marisol said at one point, stirring her coffee absently. "I felt guilty about it for years, honestly. I just needed to say it before I got married, start my new chapter with a clean conscience, you know?" Willa's expression shifted at that, something hardening in her face that I recognized from years earlier. The same controlled stillness she'd carried through those final weeks of senior year. "You didn't do this for me," she said quietly. "You did this for yourself. You're not actually sorry for what it cost me. You're relieved you finally get to stop carrying it." Marisol didn't have much of a response to that, just an uncomfortable silence that stretched long enough to become its own kind of answer. We left shortly after that, and once we were outside, walking together toward the parking lot in the cool evening air, Willa finally said something that had clearly been building the entire conversation. "I think I need to talk to Corbin now. Not because I expect anything to come of it. He's married, he's happy. I'm not trying to reopen some old romance. I just think, after everything, he deserves to actually know the truth from me directly, the same way I just made Marisol tell me the truth directly. It feels unfinished otherwise." I told her I thought that made sense, and a few days later she reached out to him carefully through a mutual old classmate who still had his current contact information, explaining briefly that something important had come up regarding that night 10 years ago and asking if he'd be willing to talk. He agreed, apparently without much hesitation, and Willa called me the night before their scheduled conversation. Nervous in a way that reminded me, oddly, of the same shaking voice from that first midnight call weeks earlier. "What if he's angry?" she asked. "What if 10 years of thinking I just abandoned him for no real reason turns into resentment the second I explain it was actually based on a lie? What if he doesn't even want the explanation at this point? What if it's just easier for him to leave it in the past?" "You won't know until you actually talk to him," I said. "But I think whatever happens, you're doing the right thing giving him the truth instead of just letting the lie stay buried along with everything else." Willa called me the night after her conversation with Corbin, and I could tell from the moment she started talking that whatever had happened wasn't what either of us had braced for. "It wasn't what I expected at all," she said, her voice carrying something between relief and a strange, complicated grief. "He wasn't angry. He was just quiet for a long time after I explained everything, and then he said something I wasn't ready for." Corbin, as it turned out, had actually suspected something like this years earlier, though he'd never had any way to confirm it. He told Willa that in the weeks after their breakup, when he tried repeatedly to reach her and gotten nothing but silence, he'd eventually heard secondhand, through the same campus rumor network that had spread the original story, a slightly different version of events, one where Marisol's name came up in connection with some vague jealousy over him, though nothing concrete enough at the time to act on. He tried mentioning it to Willa once, in a message she never responded to, and after that he'd simply let it go, assuming there was no version of the situation where reopening it would actually help either of them. He said he spent maybe a year still wondering if there was more to the story, Willa told me, and then he made himself stop thinking about it because it wasn't productive, because I clearly wasn't interested in hearing from him anymore, and he needed to move forward with his own life eventually. He built an entire relationship, a marriage, 2 kids, around moving past something he always had a nagging feeling wasn't the full truth. And now, 10 years later, I'm calling to confirm exactly what he suspected the whole time. I asked her how the conversation ended, genuinely curious what closure, if any, looked like after that much time and that specific a betrayal working itself out from underneath a decade of assumptions. "He thanked me," she said, sounding almost surprised by her own answer. "Not in a bitter way. Genuinely thanked me for telling him. Said it actually helped something settle in him that had never fully settled before. Some low-level doubt he'd been carrying around without even realizing how much space it took up. He said he doesn't need anything else from me. He's happy with his life now. But he appreciated finally knowing the truth instead of just guessing at it forever." There was something in the way she described that conversation, a kind of quiet, unexpected peace settling over both of them despite the 10 years of lost time and misplaced blame, that made the whole strange chain of events feel less like an unraveling and more like something finally, belatedly, being repaired. "What about Marisol?" I asked. "Are you going to do anything else? Tell anyone else what she did? Or are you just leaving it where it is?" Willa considered that for a moment. "I thought about it a lot, actually. Part of me wanted to make sure other people from that time knew the truth too, correct the record properly, since so many people believed the original version for 10 years without ever questioning it. But honestly, I think I'm more interested in just letting my own life move forward from here than spending more energy on making sure everyone else's understanding of 10-year-old campus gossip gets updated. Corbin knows the truth," I know the truth. That feels like enough. I understood that instinct completely. The exhaustion of having spent 3 intense weeks unraveling a decade-old lie finally giving way to something simpler. A desire to just live forward instead of continuing to relitigate the past indefinitely. "What about us, though?" she said then, her voice shifting into something more tentative. "I don't want this to just be a strange, intense 3-week reconnection that fades back into silence again once everything settles down. I actually missed having you in my life, Theo, more than I let myself admit even during these weeks of texting. I don't want to lose that again just because the crisis that brought us back together is finally resolved." I felt something genuinely warm settle in my chest hearing that. An honest echo of exactly what I'd been thinking myself over the past few weeks without quite finding the words to say it first. "I don't want that either," I said. "I think we both let 10 years happen because neither of us wanted to be the one to reach out first, and honestly, that feels like a pretty avoidable mistake to make twice." She laughed, a real laugh, the first one I'd heard from her since that whole ordeal started, and something about the sound of it, familiar even after 10 years, made the entire strange arc of the past 3 weeks feel worth it. Not because a decade-old lie needed correcting for its own sake, but because somewhere in the process of correcting it, something real and worth keeping had quietly come back into both our lives. It's been almost 2 months now since that midnight phone call, and looking back, I still find it strange how a single question, asked in a shaking voice at 12:14 in the morning, ended up unraveling a decade of assumptions that 3 separate people had all been quietly carrying around without ever thinking to question them directly. Willa and I talk almost every day now, closer in some ways than we even were back in college, though there's an honesty to it now that feels different from what we had at 22, less naive, more deliberate. Both of us more aware now of how easily silence can calcify into permanence if you let enough time pass without actively fighting against it. We've made a point of visiting each other in person twice since that first call, something neither of us wanted to leave purely to texts and phone conversations this time around, and there's a comfortable, unforced quality to being around her again that honestly surprised me, given how much time had passed and how differently our lives had unfolded in the meantime. Corbin, from what Willa's told me, reached out to her once more a few weeks after their initial conversation. A short, friendly message thanking her again for the closure and mentioning, almost in passing, that he'd told his wife the full story, partly because he didn't want any lingering piece of his past sitting unspoken in his marriage, and partly, he admitted, because his wife had noticed something had shifted in him after that phone call and deserved to understand why. Willa said it felt oddly comforting, knowing that the truth had rippled outward in a small, healthy way, settling something not just for the two of them, but quietly, indirectly strengthening something in a marriage that had nothing to do with either of them anymore. Marisol, as far as either of us knows, went ahead with her wedding as planned. Willa decided, in the end, not to say anything to Marisol's fiancé or their broader social circle, reasoning that whatever Marisol had done a decade ago wasn't necessarily predictive of who she was now, and that continuing to carry anger toward her felt like giving up more of her own energy than Marisol actually deserved at this point. I understood that decision, even if some part of me still felt a lingering, unresolved frustration on Willa's behalf whenever I thought about how casually Marisol had described the lie during that coffee shop conversation, more relieved to unburden herself than genuinely accountable for what it had cost. What sticks with me most, though, thinking back over everything now, isn't really the lie itself, or even the specific mechanics of how one person's jealousy managed to quietly detonate 3 separate lives for a full decade before anyone thought to question it. It's the particular, strange power of silence, how easily Willa and I let 10 years pass without ever reaching out, both of us assuming the distance was permanent, both of us apparently thinking about each other more than either admitted, neither of us willing to be the one to break the pattern first. It took someone else's guilty conscience, timed conveniently around her own wedding, to accidentally hand us both the excuse we'd apparently been quietly waiting for all along. I asked Willa recently, half joking, whether she thought we would have ever reconnected on our own eventually, without Marisol's confession forcing the issue. She thought about it for a long moment before answering honestly. "I don't know. Maybe eventually, if enough more years passed and the awkwardness of reaching out cold finally outweighed the awkwardness of staying silent. But probably not for a long time. I think we both needed some kind of external push, even an unpleasant one, to actually do what we should have done years earlier on our own. I think about that a lot now, how much of adult friendship, once life scatters people across different cities and different chapters, depends on someone actively choosing to reach across the silence rather than simply waiting for the right moment that never quite arrives on its own. Willa and I lost 10 years to exactly that kind of passive waiting, built on top of a lie neither of us even knew we were operating under. And while I can't say I'm grateful for how any of it originally happened, I've stopped being able to separate the damage from the strange, roundabout way it eventually led both of us back to something worth having again. These days, when my phone rings late at night, I don't feel the same instinct to let it go to voicemail that I used to. Some part of me, I think, has been quietly waiting ever since that midnight call to see what other conversations might still be worth having, if I'm actually willing to pick up.